Hello and welcome to Cities ABC video podcast series. My name is Dinis Guarda and talking about ideas and the biggest challenges and solutions to the problems humanity is facing. The questions and the challenges we're facing are bigger than ever, but at the same time we have a lot of opportunities to think out of the box and as well to make a world a bit better place, and as well to create something that I'm very focused, trust in tech and as well trust in innovation, which is critical, especially for the purpose of the call today. And as well, especially when it comes to the areas of cybersecurity and the areas that we are facing in terms of increasing challenges in the way we look at technology, the way we look at data, the way we look at infrastructure. These podcasts and videos are part of the platform I co-founded, citiesabc.com, a new wiki for AR, intelligent smart cities, and platform for reinventing cities and all of us citizens. And it's distributed all over the internet, has been growing quite substantial, and we're working to make it as well an independent, but as well a thriving space for having leaders talking about the way the world is moving and changing. So welcome today to an interview with Colm Murphy, that is a cybersecurity advisor for Huawei's Cybersecurity Transparency Center in Brussels. So Colm is an expert in these areas of cybersecurity and technology. And prior to joining Huawei, Colm was the International Director of BSI Group Cybersecurity and Information Resilience Professional Service Business, and responsible for this business unit's growth behind the UK and Ireland. Previously, as the Director of Espion, Colm was a founding member of the management team responsible for growing the company to international success. And this company, focused in cybersecurity technology distribution, was acquired by Exertis in November 2015, and other different areas of growth between multiple groups. Colm holds a BA from Trinity College in Dublin. He's from Ireland, a wonderful country that I really like, and the postgraduate diploma from Dublin Institute of Technology. He has 20 years experience working in cybersecurity, information resilience, privacy, e-discovery, and digital forensics, and incident response in both sales and technical roles. He has led and managed a range of products across EMEA, APAC, and the US. And right now, of course, he's leading the Cybersecurity Transparency Center in Brussels for Huawei, and in a very high-profile position, especially bearing in mind the challenge of cybersecurity and everything related with that. So welcome to our series, Colm. It's a pleasure to have you here.
No, Dinis, thank you so much. It's great to be here too.
So Colm, I'm particularly excited about talking with you, especially you represent one of probably the biggest technology company in the world right now. And as well, I know that there's a lot of things going on, but there's a lot of cool stuff. So let's focus on the cool stuff. I think I'll leave the other parts outside of this. But I would like to start. So can you tell us about your profile and background, and from education to technology, and as well, how do you see all this? How do you end up being an expert in cybersecurity and as well a global leader in this area?
Well, like a lot of things in life, some of it's by accident. I must update my profile because unfortunately for me, it's probably more than 20 years now I've been involved with cybersecurity. And back as far as when I left university, actually about 96, 97. As you know, and you'll remember, the only show in town at the time really was technology. It was the beginning of another digital transformation. You might remember the dot-com boom of the late 90s, and that was very much alive and well when I left university, and found my way into a small company in Dublin in Ireland, which was just starting to deploy security technologies to large enterprises in Ireland at the time. So the banks, the governments, the big PLCs. And I really went in as a dog's body, Dennis, like a lot of people. I was more interested in going into a small business to learn about business, actually, to understand how businesses work, everything from sales and marketing to internal operations and HR and paying people at the end of the month to the technology side. And I was really a dog's body. I found I was a pretty good dog's body and a useful dog's body, and very quickly ended up out in the field deploying these security technologies in these large organizations. So installing firewalls, gateway security, encryption devices, secure remote access. Actually, Funnily enough, as I think about security and cybersecurity, in fact, it wasn't called cybersecurity at all back then. You don't know, it was IT security or network security or data security. Cybersecurity is a relatively recent phenomenon to describe all of those things. But yeah, I was out in the field, and there was some element of digital transformation going on. And I remember thinking at the time, this internet thing that was starting to be used in new ways. And I remember security in a way was an enabler, in that you may remember things like site-to-site VPNs, where two offices or several offices around the world could securely connect to each other over the internet using this VPN technology, virtual private networks. And I that's where I cut my teeth. I was really a field engineer, an IT security engineer, installing and configuring and securing networks. And that company grew very quickly, as did a lot of companies back then, and they all didn't last, as you know. But I was young and adventurous, and I got on a plane and went to New Zealand, actually, and took a job with one of the big four auditing companies, whereby I was starting to look at the other way in. In other words, the networks I had previously set up securely, I was starting to audit them, check them, test them, and got into things at the time like penetration testing, hacking, ethical hacking. I wasn't particularly, you might say, the best ethical hacker in the world. I wasn't bad, but it certainly gave me an appreciation for that world, its value. Certainly reading and writing these very heavily technical reports. And enjoyed that actually as an adventure, and took a position thereafter with Network Associates. You know them now actually as McAfee. At the time, they were the biggest security vendor in the world, probably still are there or thereabouts. And they set me up as a kind of a fixer. I was going around Southeast Asia and Australia, back to New Zealand, Hong Kong, places like that, whereby I would arrive on site where something had gone wrong, and I was there to save the day and fix it. So I learned a lot, worked with some very interesting people, some very interesting technologies, security technologies, and struck me actually, and maybe it's because I came from the small island that is Ireland, but in that part of the world, I found them very keen to try new technologies. They wanted the latest thing, the latest version, using it in actually quite interesting ways and interesting business models. And I kept my eye on that kind of thing. But a young mid-20s guy hanging around Southeast Asia, you only get so much mileage out of it. So at the time, the dot-com bubble by then had well and truly burst. You remember, and I went actually with two colleagues of mine, ex-colleagues of mine, were looking to set up a business in Ireland, cybersecurity business, and they asked me would I come along as a kind of the technical side. So I hopped on a plane back to Ireland, and in the back of a darkened pub, we hatched a plan in Dublin, and that was in 2002 thereabouts. So we set up a business, a technology distribution business, where we take emerging security technologies from around the world and bring them into the UK and Irish marketplace and sell them through a channel of resellers. And in parallel, we set up essentially a cybersecurity consulting business to do penetration testing and incident response type services. And we stuck with that. Every year, Dennis, was going to be the year, but we stuck with that for 15 years. And eventually, each business was acquired. You mentioned Exertis, a pan-European technology distribution business, acquired our distribution business. At that stage, we had offices around Europe and in New York. And BSI, being the British Standards Institution, acquired the consulting business, and that became the kind of the heart of their global cybersecurity professional services business. And I worked with BSI for a couple of years. We acquired some more businesses, and we grew that business around the world. They've offices in many, many countries around the world, and we grew that business outwards into those offices. And that came to an end last year, whereby I decided to do something completely different and took this role with Huawei. And that was interesting for me, in that, you know, it's back into an enterprise for one, which I missed actually, because I was always the kind of consultant, you know, talking to them from the outside in, and it's very nice to be back in and looking at all of the great things that happen in this massive organization around the world, and you know, to play my part in the cybersecurity discussion, in advancing our cybersecurity agenda generally, and I think just being for others a window into this global business and into the cybersecurity operations around the world. So that's the whirlwind version.
Now, very impressive, and I think from Deloitte to McAfee, and of course, right now with one of the biggest technology companies, probably the biggest company in the world in technology at the moment. So there's quite a big journey. So on that level, I would like just to touch on you touch a bit of the evolution from the .com to the full digital transformation we are living in, and as well, we still have a big challenge going ahead because a huge part of the world economy is still in paper and is still offline. So what are your views on how business and governments can cope with this digital transformation, especially someone like you that have been going through all this kind of journey in terms of this acceleration of digital and all the things that come with cybersecurity attached?
Yeah. Well, you know, I'd say one could say, you know, there's not enough digital transformation, or if there is, it doesn't happen fast enough. Actually, and I've heard you say that, Dinis, and it's fair to say it. But I think, that said, if we think back to the .com era, you know, web applications, it's really only now, in the last, I don't know, 10 years, that we start to see people really adapt web applications en masse, and that the general population, public, starting to be comfortable with them and use them, and instead of walking down the road to visit your service provider X or Y, you know, you sit in your house and interact with them through a web application. So, you know, on the one hand, we say it doesn't happen fast enough, but on the other hand, I think these things do actually take some time. And while we're all impatient, and probably rightly so, I think that we have to recognize that things happen probably more slowly sometimes than we'd like. And sometimes I think actually that it happens under the radar. We think of the big digital transformation events like, you know, movies or music, the obvious ones. But there are others that, let's say, aren't kind of transformational in the sense of everybody knows about them. I mean, one for example, that I think about from time to time happen quietly, and probably not people are even aware of it, is in a profession, the legal profession, which actually isn't very well known for being, let's say, you know, technological leaders or being the first to embrace any new technology. But, you know, I'm from Ireland, which is a common law jurisdiction, as opposed to, let's say, continental European civil law. In common law jurisdictions, there's this thing in law whereby if you're in litigation, you need to do this document exchange. So I get documents that from you that are relevant to our dispute, and I have to give you documents. And in times gone by, you know, that was a whole load of junior lawyers sitting in a room, flicking through paper and pulling out potentially relevant, you know, correspondence and contracts and whatever. And in fact, I remember even a long time ago meeting a family friend who had inky fingers, and I was asking the person, you know, what's with the inky fingers, and it was because they were manually redacting confidential information from these documents. So, you know, that particular industry has actually unbelievably transformed over the last 10 years or less, in that now they use machine learning, AI algorithms to do some training on a document set to point out what most likely looks like a relevant document, and then the computer goes off and finds them, and clearly, you know, has transformed that particular element of what's the law and an important part of our lives, or certainly corporate life, in that it's much faster, cheaper, probably. And the science says, more accurate. Humans make mistakes. They're tired. They're not interested. The computer, it learns, and it usually makes better decisions. In that sense. So I think the point being, a long way to say, sometimes things happen that aren't transformative in a big sense, but they're happening in the industry quietly and under the radar, and it will take time. So with some patience, I think we'll see more of it. But maybe to hone in on a lens I view the world through, the cybersecurity lens. People say cybersecurity is an obstacle sometimes. I mean, the cloud, for example. I don't want to put my stuff in the cloud because, security this and privacy that. So, I wonder about that. I think actually, there's a spotlight on cybersecurity at the moment, but actually cybersecurity and cybersecurity practitioners are a sophisticated bunch, and it's a mature enough industry, and there's a lot of organizations that are very good at it, and certainly cloud service providers have all of the credentials, the certifications, they're staffed, they've skilled, they're 24/7, and I think for the most part many of these can do security a lot better than any organization could do on their own, and they have the scale, so they can do it in a more cost-effective way. So security, I think, sometimes used to say it's an obstacle to digital transformation projects. I think sometimes if we could be more thoughtful about that. Well, actually, I might rather sometimes my data is stored in a data center where I know there's 24/7 security operations center, there's monitoring, they've sophisticated technology, they've the third-party credentials and certifications that demonstrate they know what they're doing. So, cybersecurity, I think, shouldn't be an obstacle. And I would say, of course, when you look at some of the more, let's say, exciting digital transformation areas, or areas of digital transformation, fintech, for example, or blockchain, or IoT, cybersecurity needs to be very much up front and center in those change projects. Clearly fintech, obviously security is a central issue, blockchain too. But when you move beyond those, just to say smart cities, or to to other areas of change medicine, and others, automotive, transport, so on. I think security, there's a new topic in that if something goes wrong, and if there's an event, in theory, possibly, that could result in the loss of human life. And that's different, that's new. And therefore, again, the cybersecurity topic issue should be up front and center. Previously, the cybersecurity person was in the back room and called on when needed, but these days I think that they're very much up front and center. And I think even if you look at modern day boards, and actually Huawei is a great example, they have the vocabulary to discuss cybersecurity issues. They're interested in them, they pursue them, they ask about them, the same way as they can analyze and review a financial statement. They can discuss cybersecurity, and it's not good enough in my mind for a board in an organization these days to say, that cybersecurity thing's for somebody else at some other meeting. Well, it isn't. It's a central area of risk, should be discussed, and certainly I see that in spades here in Huawei. It's interesting to see right from the very top of the organization that it's a commonly discussed topic. It's great for people like me and others who work in that area.
I think that, so looking at precisely like you just said, so from the digital transformation, we went through the work of cybersecurity and IT to be kind of the foundation, the plumbing, to become the central stage. And this is the central stage right now for governments, for business, for institutions, and for instance, like you said, in terms of healthcare, cybersecurity can create, well, can actually save millions of lives or even kill millions of lives if we don't have the right data, the right infrastructure. So how do you see the cybersecurity industry best practice at the stage where we are?
Yeah, best practice. When we talk about best practice, Dennis, kind of one word usually comes to mind, and it's kind of fragmented. There's so many different. Look, it's technology, and of course, there's different elements of technology that require their own best practices and standards and certifications. There's so many across the world. And of course, there's vendor-driven best practices because they know their technology best, so they describe how one should correctly secure and configure their technology. So it's actually extraordinarily fragmented. And there are many. In fact, there's an interesting website I go to from time to time. It's the Cybersecurity, I can't remember the name, but it's Cybersecurity Startup Observatory or something along those lines, whereby they track startups in the cybersecurity space. And it's a mind-boggling array of thousands, tens of thousands of organizations all around the world, all doing different things, saying, buy our thing and you'll comply with X, or buy our thing and all your troubles will go away. So, in terms of best practice, it's difficult to keep up, and it's something I've seen done very well again here in Huawei. They have teams of people whose role it is to gather all of these best practice inputs, consolidate them, evaluate them, and they get fed as inputs into, for example, product design requirements. So the security requirements of product design. So it's very fragmented, and certainly I think, just an example of best practice. Huawei, I think, is like more than 240 different certifications for, various products. And then dozens and dozens of management system certifications. So and all of these things are, for us to provide assurance to others that we do things in accordance with best practice. But, there's a lot of them. It would be tremendously helpful to us and others. I mean, if it's hard for us, huge global organization in 170 countries, think of how hard it is for, an SME or a small startup trying to break into new markets. So and there's, of course, then the regulatory obligations you can say also are technically could be seen as best practices. So, you've got all of these requirements. So it would be tremendously helpful, I think, to have some consolidation in that space and to have some effort to align around the world and to open up that discussion. I think one good example, actually, a success story, probably you could say, is GDPR in Europe. Previously there was 28 different privacy regimes, one for each member state at the time. And the GDPR was designed to kind of harmonize that. It's difficult for any organization to go into each of those member states, some small countries, some large, and comply with each individual regime. So GDPR was, I think, tremendously helpful in that regard. And I think in the telco space, certainly we'd welcome any initiative along that line. And we do see progress in that area, but certainly it can't happen fast enough.
So one of the things is, so we know this importance, and I think you touch a very important thing, that is the relationship between different countries' approaches to cybersecurity, different regulatory approaches, and even just aligning efforts and certification, which is a big network and a big challenge in itself. So how do you cope and prepare, like the basics, let's say? Because I think when you talk about cybersecurity, there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of the dark web, my data, and all the things. But there's a lot of very basic stuff that business and companies and actually organizations and cities have to cope. So how do you cope with that and prepare? Let's say from a very basic perspective, I think this is particularly important for anyone listening to us, but as well, even big organizations and cities and countries have no clue about this. You probably know that better than me.
Well, I think that they do have a clue, actually. And I think that in some ways there's two parallel conversations going on. And there's the kind of, it's a good story in the media, cybersecurity, you know, hackers, the dark web you mentioned. And it's a good story, and it's news, interesting from a human interest point of view. And that can tend to, you know, generate some alarmist noise and this feeling that actually we're not prepared. But I think that organizations have been doing this for a long time and actually are very well prepared and handle and manage already cybersecurity. And it's a question of risk management, and they do it very well. And I think that there's a degree of maturity in the industry that's probably, when you talk to cybersecurity experts, we know this, but when you listen to politicians, it's like there's two parallel tracks or two parallel conversations, and they're not at all alike, you know. But certainly when you listen to the experts, you talk to the experts, and you look at some of the many organizations around the world, they do cybersecurity very well. And of course, there are things that happen from time to time, and it's really at this stage is how well you respond to those events. You know, how do you contain, well, firstly, can you detect it promptly, and how you contain things. And I think no longer, at least in the world I'm in, is, you know, being hacked, you know, a dirty word. It's more around how you handle that, how you manage that, how you're set up to deal with that, detect, respond and contain, and, you know, comply then with whatever obligations you have. But I think generally in terms of coping, I think it's a good way to think about it is actually that it's a shared cope. You know, that it's a shared responsibility. There's a lot of players, and you take Huawei. You know, we make the technology that provide the communication technology. There are operators who then operate it and manage it in their networks, and they're very sophisticated, in fact, very mature, and have, you know, extraordinarily an abundance of cybersecurity skills and experience and expertise. And then you've service providers running services across the top of it, and then you've consumers. And I think, and of course, don't forget, I think the government, the policy makers, you know, set the rules, and the regulatory bodies, you know, enforce them and oversee them and perform the due diligence. So there's a whole lot of players in any ecosystem when it comes to cybersecurity. And I think the way to cope, as you put it, is for all of those players to be joined up and to work together and to share information, and, you know, not only within industry but cross industry. I mean, financial services, in fact, is a great, I think, example to look to as a industry that has done cybersecurity extraordinarily well. And I think they were always first to the party, and for obvious reasons, the money involved, and they were a target. But they've built up very sophisticated, you know, sharing mechanisms and learning mechanisms and technological solutions over the years, and, you know, others can learn from that too. So I'd say, Dennis, you know, it's a shared responsibility. The eyes are on some players from time to time, but, you know, the modern technological piping that you mentioned is vast. So there's what we call this attack surface. You know, it's broad, and it goes beyond any one player, any one industry. So therefore, we need to find ways to work better together and to discuss these things more openly.
I think you made a very good point that sometimes we only look, especially when you think about cybersecurity, there's a tendency to think about the negative part. All the issues with attacks, all the issues of big risk.
You know what, Dennis, I've thought about this. And just when you mention that, everything, think about cybersecurity and even the lexicon, you know, a firewall, gateway. And all of the language of it is about stopping stuff, you know, and that's fair enough. That's just what it was. But I don't think it's particularly helpful. It's not very polite. We try to find some way to make cybersecurity more an invisible thing, but at the moment, you know, it's in the spotlight for in the geopolitical discussion, but actually, and it would lead you to believe that, you know, there's all these gaping holes everywhere, but actually there isn't. You know. But sorry, I cut across you there, Dennis, but you just sparked that thought in my mind.
No, it's a very good thought. And you're right, actually, because if you look at, for instance, COVID-19, everyone right now is working remotely. Everyone is dependent of digital process, even organizations and countries that were not. And effectively is working. So we have to think, I think if you look at the geopolitical news, you only think normally about the negative stuff. And actually there's a lack of education in mainstream media and in mainstream networks around these topics. And I think that's a big, important thing that we have to consider. So that gets me to my next question. So we are among COVID-19, and that is one of the biggest crises that we have that is affecting health, financial services, economic systems, is destroying entire economies. But we still have an entire ecosystem of technology and infrastructure that is working. And like you said, and I think you pointed to a very good point, it's working properly and is moving, even with all the risks. So my question is, very concretely, when we talk about cities and governments, I'm working with a couple of governments and with a lot of cities. If definitely there's a kind of, in one end, the professionals doing that are doing it extremely well, but then the narrative, it's quite complex. So my question is, I don't know if you could elaborate how in top level cities and the governments can actually look at cyber threats and as well deal with that in a better way to probably make the bridge between the experts like yourselves and the rest of the population to understand there's a stability and there's not so much myths around this as people might think about it.
Yeah. Well, as a European in Europe, you know, I see a lot of work being done there actually in the regulatory framework. So, you know, there's already things like the NIS directive, which requires providers of critical services to be very mindful and take care of security, report incidents, and work closely with the national regulators to you know, make sure everything's going in the right direction. So there's a certain amount of work already underway and has been underway for some time and will only continue to ensure and I suppose hold service providers and people like us and others to account from a cybersecurity point of view, and that's certainly, I think, helpful. We all want to give our stakeholders that kind of assurance that things are going well. They are, when they're going well, they are going well. Of course, one way we feel, and I feel that we can do that is through you know, independent oversight in the form of certification schemes and using these best practice standards you mentioned to have some third party assess a product or a service or a, you know, a network and say, you know, we've looked at this and we're authorized by the government, for example, as qualified third party experts to do this, and we've looked at it and we think it's very much in line with, you know, best practice standard, and therefore we're going to apply this certificate, and that certificate can then assure a buyer, for example, or a service provider user that it is what it should be, that it will operate as it should be, that it's secured in accordance with best practices, that it handles your data in accordance with privacy laws, and so on. So I think, you know, that's you know, normal. I mean, when you think about things like electricity or water, and the water we drink, it's not always it doesn't always come out the tap the way it should be, but for the most part it does, and that's because there's a whole process of you know, standards and checks. And the airline industry is actually a really good example. know, and that includes right down to the passengers in terms of how you behave when you step on a plane, to the regulatory environment that describes how it's all going to work, to the manufacturers who make them. You know, we all get on planes and we trust them, and we don't think so much about all that's gone into getting this plane off the ground and getting you from A to B. But, you know, there's a whole kind of set of shared responsibilities in that model that I think can be applied to across a whole load of things to protect us as citizens, to protect cities, to protect governments, and so on and so on. So, you know, I think that's a good analogy, actually, the airline industry, or the aviation industry more broadly.
That's a very important thing, and I think it's going to be increasing. I think one of the things probably that we have to take from 2020 is that digital transformation will be accelerating to a path that probably never seen in the last 20 years. And I think definitely especially the next 1 year is going to be critical with everything going on. So that brings me to the next question. It's probably more sensitive, but I want to take it from the most positive side. So Huawei is one of the biggest 5G developer in the world, and there's a lot of issues around that. But I would like to look at the challenges and the opportunities you see on that. I know that there's a lot of discussion, a lot of, to be honest, a lot of people not understanding what they're talking about, but everyone has an opinion. So how do you see that? Yeah,
it's a topical. It's in the mainstream media. You know, who would have thunk it, as they say where I come from. You know. Firstly, you know, 5G, let's just look at 5G for what it is. It's not a revolution. I prefer to see it as this evolution, and it's an evolution of 4G. So, and it's standards driven. So there's 3GPP, the global standards organization responsible for describing, you know, the rules of 5G and the protocols. And actually, as a matter of fact, and not a lot of people seem to remember or know this outside of the telco industry generally, that, you know, 5G is a whole lot more security in it than 4G ever did, just by nature of the standard. So it's got more encryption, stronger encryption. It's got more in authentication between various components. You know, it's got better denial of service protection. It's got fake base station. You know, there's a whole load of things in there that weren't in its predecessor. So just out of the box, let's say, you know, 5G is actually more secure, and you happily connect to your 4G or even 3G network right now today, and, you know, away you go. 5G, as per the standard, is more secure. That said, and you talked about, you know, the opportunities, and I won't go into them because I'm sure you talk many times with and I've heard you talk many times with others about, you know, the amazing opportunities. And you mentioned some already. You mentioned healthcare, medicine, transportation. And for me, you know, connecting the unconnected is a big opportunity. 5G. We talk about smart cities all the time, but what about the rural, those in the rural areas too? So, you know, there are all these opportunities, and as we mentioned before, some of them obviously involve, you know, humans, and the potential for something could go wrong, could be catastrophic. So therefore, the security conversation slightly changes. And that's one thing I think we need to be mindful of with 5G. Therefore, you know, security rightly should be discussed and rightly should be front and center. And we've already discussed that. I think another thing that about 5G, and this is interesting for me because the 5G network architecture looks more like a traditional IT network. You know, there's more stuff, let's say, and there's more software, there's virtualization, and there's zones. And that, in a sense, is a good thing, obviously, because it becomes more configurable. You can have different security policies for different customers or different scenarios, and it's very flexible. And therein, you know, therefore, those opportunities can be exploited. But what it does mean is that attack surface, and I think I mentioned those words before. In other words, the amount of things you could potentially target is more. But then again, you know, a lot of that's behind closed doors and isn't accessible on the internet, so to speak. So, there's a certain amount of alarmism there. You people and experts, I should say really experts, have been securing those kinds of networks for 20 years and more. And they're very good at it. And there's a well-worn path. And I think the operators are a very sophisticated bunch, and they know very well how to manage their networks, and they're very good at securing their networks. And I think they're, very well up to that task of securing those networks. And of course, they'll work within the regulatory frameworks, but I think they're very well up to that task. So we talk about 5G in this alarmist way, but it's more secure, and it's than its predecessors, and it's very configurable, and very and the expertise exists, and there's an abundance of expertise out there. And of course, we hear about cybersecurity skills shortages sometimes, and there's truth to that. But that's an opportunity. There's a growing number of people involved in computer science and studying computer science, and as they emerge from that, they'll be well equipped to take on those roles. And there's work underway there, I think, across the world to develop a larger pool of expertise. But I agree with you that it's the two conversation thing. There's a parallel conversation. There's a conversation sometimes that's when politicians are going to be politicians, and they speak to their constituents, and they say things they may think their constituents want to hear. But it's unhelpful, I think, for the industry, this kind of alarmist. It spreads some fear, and it's kind of unnecessary. And of course, as some of these opportunities you mentioned are exploited over time, certainly there'll be rules of the game, and there'll be expectations in terms of security and monitoring and structures around that. So look, I agree with you that the world and the cybersecurity industry and the technology or the IT industry generally is well equipped and very well ready to take on the challenges, already taking on that challenge.
Very good point. And I think one of the things that if you think probably around there was no issues with 3G and 4G, and suddenly with 5G there's a massive issues. So this brings us as well into a kind of artificial created problem. But as well, one question I have is, how do you see the verified security standards in the 5G and telecom industry, being you are an expert on this area?
Yeah, that's a good one actually, Dennis, because I talked about I think fragmentation in standards, and there's lots of them, and there's different standards in different places, and I think there's never been a kind of globally adopted cybersecurity standard for the telco industry until recently. And that was recently there's a standard has emerged called NISAS/SCAS, Network Evaluation Security Assurance Scheme. I think maybe possibly have jumbled that up, but you get the idea. It's a security assurance scheme specifically targeting the telco industry, and specifically at the vendor level of products that get purchased by operators and then end up running the communication networks. So, for example, there was never a scheme. There's stuff like common criteria, which is widely known around the world and widely accepted by governments around the world as assurance that a particular a generic IT product, does what it says on the tin from a security point of view. But it wouldn't have, for example, specific tests within that for a wireless base station, for example. So 3GPP being the standards, 5G, 4G, 3G standards people, along with their colleagues in the GSMA, that being the kind of global industry association for the telecom industry, came together and created this standard. And it's very much targeted towards the needs of the telco network from a security perspective. Things like common criteria I mentioned, that could take a year or two, in fact. In fact, Huawei just was awarded Common Criteria ELA 4+, which is the highest level of security assurance you can get from that particular scheme. And I think it took the best part of 2 years. That was a world first for our 5G RAN, the radio access side and the core. But it took a long time, and that causes some difficulties, I think, given the kind of frequency which new products get created and so on. So as I mentioned, NISAS was designed to overcome some of those challenges, and it's very much a global effort. Very much has the support of all the players, from the vendors like us and our peers, and the operators. The largest operators in the world are fully behind this. The testing laboratories, so in other words, the government approved independent testing labs that can actually perform the tests or the checks. And really what we want to see is, the policymakers and others, the regulatory, our colleagues in the regulatory side of things, to see NISAS as a valuable way to provide that kind of third-party assurance and level the playing field. And I think we're undergoing testing now. There's two phases. There's a kind of a process test and then the physical testing of devices in a lab. We've completed the first part, and we're undergoing the second part right now, actually, as we speak, to be completed in August. And that's kind of a world's first. We put ourselves forward as the guinea pigs. But it's still not perfect, and that will evolve over time. It's undergoing a kind of a phase 2 revamp that will maybe make that there be different levels. For example, the European Cybersecurity Act, I think rightly, has different levels of assurance, like basic, substantial, and high, or something, whereby different products can get different levels depending on what they are and where they'll be used and what they'll be used for. And I think NISAS and so on is undergoing a version 2 revamp. But certainly that's one to watch, I would say, in that space. And it's specifically for the telco industry and would be particularly useful for that entire ecosystem. I mentioned the shared responsibility. So in other words, to give all of those players assurance that, when they buy something, that it's being tested, checked, and those tests and checks are particularly specific to what the device actually is.
On this area, another question I have is, so one thing is the telecom, the other thing is other industry sectors that are really increasing needing standards, because we have so much verticals, like you mentioned finance, which is a critical one, and it's probably the most sophisticated one, but for instance, healthcare, and we have, of course, you mentioned navigation, airlines, it never ends, the quality, especially as the world economy becomes more interlinked and more digital. So what kind of standards do we need for that? And as well, on that relate as well, standards like the 3GPP and NASAS, which are areas that I know that you're working and very stable on that. Yeah.
Look, I think standards generally are a good thing in that, if you think at a basic level, you buy something, I don't know, electrical good or a car seat for your child to put in the back of the car, you assume actually that from where you have bought it, have made some checks and have bought a good one, and that it's been somehow independently certified to do what it should do from a safety or security point of view. And I think we've kind of just come to, we don't think about that much in normal everyday life. I think that you mentioned things like IoT. You think about it actually with IoT, you go into a store or an electronics store or a supermarket actually even, and buy some IoT device for €5 or €10 and bring it home and plug it in, and it's now on the internet. So, certainly I think that any schemes that can provide some assurance to consumers or others that, an IoT device has some kind of basic level of security is a good thing, and you can see why that would be. So I think that people want and need and expect that the things they use and buy have been checked and tested and independently validated. And the UK is actually has an interesting scheme in if you want to do business with the UK government, you must have this thing called cyber essentials. And this is basically, if you want to do any kind of work for them at all as an organization, you're going to tender for some job, you got to have this. And it's just it shows you've a very, done some basic level of cybersecurity hygiene and had some authorized third party confirm that. And the same kinds of schemes exist in Germany, France, and in other places around the world. And I think that it's just, there's a certain amount of common sense to it that, when we use these communication technologies, that we would like to think that some third party has checked them, tested them, that they're good, that they're going to perform correctly when they should, and when something goes wrong, that they'll go wrong in the right way. And that's important too, that if you think of a lock in the door, you hear about these electronic locks, you can open it with an app on your phone. Do you want the door to fail open, or do you want the door to fail shut? So there's these kinds of basic questions that the experts will deal with, and they'll deal within the standards, and they'll certify the device to that standard, and that when we buy that thing, we'll know that it will do what it's meant to do. Don't ask me, by the way, whether it should fail shut or fail open. That's a tricky one.
I think that is another interview, especially if you look at that. So I think one of the things that you mentioned, IoT, and IoT right now is visible in everything we do, from the sensors in our phones to the sensors in shopping centers. Of course, right now, everything with the COVID-19 and a lot of different things. So one of the questions that I think it's particularly important to ask is, how can we measure cybersecurity, both for countries, cities, and business? And as well on that level, and I want to touch, it's more technical part, but how can we measure this and the meaning of developing security standards for both public and industries at large? And I think this is very important, because if you get these standards, I think you can actually create more measurement and more quality, and they probably kill a lot of the issues that we have, mostly created by politicians, not necessarily by experts, but as well come up with more I think the standards and the quality assurance always help people to feel safer, and as well bringing the standards to schools, to universities, and to cities and public makes a big difference. How do you see this, and as well, especially the developing of security standards for public and industries?
Yeah, it's probably an extension of the last question, in a sense, of what we just discussed. And I think I mentioned actually the European Union, through the Cybersecurity Act, will have this element of measurement through a basic and a substantial and a high structure, whereby it depends on the nature of what it is you're trying to do with the product, who's going to use the product, and all of those things. And I think that's useful. And certainly I think that the people may overlook it, but that the basic level, actually it's very important, just from human point of view, that you wanted to have some basic level of security regardless. It might be €5 in the supermarket, but you want it to be safe from security point of view, and you don't want it to be an avenue for somebody into your home network or office network through which they can start to infiltrate your data. So I think that's a good thing. So that's one way to perform the measurement, is you obviously have different schemes which provide different levels of assurances, and that if there's a service provider who wants to play in a certain space, that comes with a higher risk, well then they have to go for the high level, and there's a higher cost to do that. And of course, already we find certainly dealing with governments, they expect and require their service providers to have these certifications, to whether they're security management systems in terms of how they'll handle data, privacy management systems in terms of how they'll obviously adhere to their legal obligations and others, and they already do that. So in other words, often it's a kind of a cost of doing business in some places is that you have to comply with these standards, and that kind of forces the bar up and gives a degree of measurement. There's an interesting, I know you're in, I think, Portugal today. There's an interesting company which has a large presence in Portugal, actually, that does, I won't mention by name, they're in the area of providing cybersecurity risk ratings, and that's a little bit like ratings. I should just say cybersecurity ratings, just a little bit like a credit score or a credit rating, and they do that by monitoring the public web. In other words, for example, if you were an organization and you were hacked and data was leaving your organization, that can be seen across the internet. The internet's kind of a public utility, and there's various ways to see what happens on it. So they don't need to look inside the walls of your organization to know that you've been hacked, because there's some computer connecting outwards to some known command and control center somewhere. And they do some very clever stuff in and around that space, actually, but it's very much at an enterprise level. And it's used, for example, in supply chain risk management, whereby you're going to do your due diligence on some supplier, and you can get a cybersecurity rating from these organizations of that company. So there's work being done. It's fairly immature, Dinis, but it's certainly an area that there's work being done. More work will be done, and I think it wouldn't surprise me sometime soon, if we hear more about the idea of measurement and ratings and so on. It's an interesting space, actually.
Yeah, that's very enthusiastic, and I really, it's one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, standards, and I think it's key to kill a lot of the issues we have. For instance, even people that have in my network that are supposed to be quite well educated, and actually some of them even quite tech savvy, they coming up with some things that scares me. If they feel like this, of course, the rest of the population is completely lost. Yeah. So I think that brings me to the next question, and we have only 2 to go. It's been a long but a fantastic insights, and I appreciate the technology knowledge and the layers, because the devil is on details on this thing. So Huawei, as one of the global leader powerhouses, as well, has been having a huge progress in cybersecurity and security verifications, bearing in mind the quantity of people using your devices, as well all the infrastructure you do on a global scale, not just in China, but first you are in Brussels, which is the headquarters of the European Union, and we are as well over there looking at that. So can you tell us about this progress that was done on this cybersecurity and security verification by Huawei, especially the new ERNW review source code for Huawei 5G core network?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned too, I mean, look, clearly we do a whole lot of things internally at an operational level. I guess very quickly, there's 4 kind of things. It's what we do internally, and we do an awful lot of that. We've many thousand people working in cybersecurity. In fact, it's interesting for me to find out when I came here that there's more than 200 people pen testing all of our stuff internally before it leaves the building. So we've a whole lot of very sophisticated internal initiatives underway, and there's a substantial investment, obviously, that goes alongside that. And we have third-party partners who will test us and oversee all of those initiatives and tap us on the shoulder if they see room for improvement. And of course, then we have the whole, our customers who of course, they will hire third parties of their own and test our things again in their deployed, both pre-deployment and I suppose post-deployment. In fact, here in Brussels, we facilitate that. So we're one of the places in the world where our clients, our customers, and their experts can come perform those kinds of tests. And ENRW is one you mentioned. They've looked at recently the source code, and there's debates out there about source code, third-party source code evaluation, and source code validation, and source code security checks. And we're one of the few that allow it. In other words, we probably actually the only in the telco space that allow it. Now we say, yeah, come look at our code. Our door is open, and for that reason, we're definitely, if not one of the most, if not the most inspected companies in the world. But we open it up, and they can come here to Brussels, and they're here all the time, and they get access to code, and that's what you referred to earlier. And people say, well, what's the value in that? Well, there's a lot of value in it because code software developers understand what good code looks like. They understand what a mature software development process looks like. They understand how to both manually and through automated tools find things in code that may be bugs or could be seen as vulnerabilities or could potentially cause problems in certain configuration scenarios and so on. And we welcome that, and that makes us good. That makes us better. That keeps us on our toes. And I think the more of that you do, the more people look over your shoulder, the better it is for everybody. It's better for us because, we feel the pressure. We feel the pressure to be good. It's better for our customers because they know that by the time that code lands in their network, it's been through many, many hands and many eyes, as we like to say. So I think I have answered the question. I'm not sure if, we've mentioned some other things already in relation to the certifications, and I mentioned NISAS, SCAS, which we're undergoing right now and expect to see the end of that next month, and then the CCELA 4 Plus for our 5G RAN and core, first in the world. So, there's a whole lot of things going on. And as somebody who's been around this game for more than 20 years, there's some really good stuff happening in here, and it's really good to see. And it's refreshing for me to be back inside, back in at the cutting edge of it, and to see all of the initiatives that are underway, and will certainly continue into the future.
Amazing. So one of the last questions, and keeping and finishing this on a positive note. So as someone that has been in the industry for a long time, and now of course leading a big responsible operation, and especially in the center of Europe, which is as well one of the leading world economies. So how do you see, or can you tell us about some case studies, some industry case studies from a city, from a government, or from a business that are really successful, and then people don't always speak about it? You mentioned a couple positive elements that things work, and that actually that we should, and actually it's true. I'm in Portugal, you are in Brussels, we have people in this behind our scenes that are all over the world in 5 continents, and at the same time we are working and we manage to move forward. And sometimes people underestimate that work. But I think it's important to look especially at constructive case studies, because I think one of the things that I'm particularly concerned, and that's why I created citiesabc.com, and that's why I've been working with a lot of governments and cities, is that normally there's only a tendency to look at the really bad things, or at least the media top lines of the disgraces or disasters. When in the end of the day, the economy is working, we're still moving forward. And the more we trust the economy, the more we trust technology, the more we can go forward. So if you could give us some constructive case studies that you can use and that we can benchmark, or at least some ideas or suggestions for the people that will listen to this interview, there will be more, of course, people experts in this area.
Yeah, as I listened to you there, I think you answered your own question, because the case study right now, where we're here, I'm here, you're there, is, I think, it's obvious, but it's really good. And we've had a few blips along the journey of a video freezing or a voice sounding slightly odd, but I think that itself is actually a really interesting case study. I think that there's stuff happening in all sorts of industries. We've mentioned the obvious exciting ones in terms of transportation and medicine, things like that. But I think some other less obvious ones, like the legal example I gave, the legal world, I think there's interesting things happening in fintech. I think stuff happening on blockchain, and I know that's a particular area that you're interested in, and I'm wondering, will they ever just find a use case and get on with it? I hear more people say, look what we're doing on blockchain, rather than saying just look what we're doing. I don't remember you won't remember either, back in 1995 visiting a website to say, we bring you this website using TCP/IP, and the internet, or whatever it was. Certainly, I think that all these interesting things that are going on, sometimes where we've high expectations, should just get on with it and find some use cases and stop dropping the AI terminology or the blockchain terminology or whatever it is, and just people, I don't think, consume services in that way. They use it because they like it or it does something useful for them. I think there's loads of interesting stuff happening in Germany, actually, in fact, in the space we work in, and I know it's probably slightly boring, but the whole telco landscape is, I think the Germans have taken a very mature, kind of fair, quite rigorous and all-inclusive, actually, approach to the cybersecurity challenge within the 5G sphere, for example. And it's a case study that's probably maybe not what you had in mind, but I'd certainly encourage anyone interested in 5G and 5G security to look at what the Germans are doing in that regard, in terms of how they're managing the risk as a country. I think that's quite novel, and certainly many countries could learn from it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting case because Germany, as well as some of the most advanced rules in terms of privacy data and a lot of things in cybersecurity. So yeah, there's a lot of much more. So I thank you so much, Colm, for this time and interview. It's been a pleasure. I think there's probably space for a lot of other things, especially you mentioned healthcare, financial data, and IoT, which is in itself a massive area. But while we leave top level, the idea was today to have an overview about these things. So I appreciate your time and as well insights. And I'm sure that you're going to follow up with other interviews. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thanks,
Cheers.
Dinis.
Thank you.